right, welcome back to the Skillist podcast. I'm Brad Salon from Root School.
I'm Matt Corradino from Caribbean Earth Skills.
All right, so this week we are talking about survival priority, or as Matt calls it.
What? Are you bowing? Look at that. He's bowing right now. Thank you. I already won the argument. It's already over. The
sacred order.
What do you mean?
Yes.
The sacred order, bro.
The order of
That's not my
sacredness.
words.
Yes.
That's the boss. That's Tom. That's Tom's words. I'm not going to claim that those are mine. But they're pretty damn good words.
Word.
Methinks.
Yeah. So I'm interested to have this conversation with you because unlike a lot of people who teach these skills, you've actually done a lot of survival. Much more than I have. But I'm interested just to hear your perspective on it and to see, do you really think, for everyone who doesn't know, the shelter, water, fire, food, that's the sacred order, dude.
Yeah. I didn't put the dude in there, okay? That's your dude, bro.
That's been the standard for a long time, and I wonder...
It is.
Do you stick to that? Do you modify it? Do you add caveats?
I stick to it. Well, there's always caveats. I stick to it because, so there's two reasons why I stick to it. First of all, everything is fluid, right? Everything in survival is fluid. Like every situation is fluid. For instance, like in the Caribbean, unless it's the rainy season, at least in this part of the Caribbean, you could get away without having a shelter for quite a long time. So that gives you some more fluidity. Or in other situations, it might just be where if it's going to be a while, where food might come in first. But it's still, the reason why is because of the energy burn in a shelter. When you build a shelter, it takes so much energy, and you want to do that while you're fresh. And that's why I just always stick to that. It's like always the shelter first, because if you're fresh, right, you in theory ate earlier that day, or you're only a day removed from your normal diet, you've got your normal level of energy, and no matter what your shelter is going to be, it's going to take a lot of energy to build it. And then you're going to need sleep. You're going to need a place to rest from the wind, from the rain, from the cold, from the sun, and the deterioration without being protected from the elements is pretty quick. And if it wasn't for the energy burn, yes, you could put that off till after you've procured some food, but it's a slippery slope there. If you wait too long, you're still not getting the food, and now you're not getting sleep, and now it's too sunny to sleep, or too cold, or too windy, or too rainy. It's like then your energy level is like compounded, the drop. So That's why I always say shelter first. Now water,
Well, so with shelter, that's interesting because mostly I hear people refer to it in the context of like what will kill you first. And it's like exposure can kill you a lot quicker than, starvation or dehydration. And so you need to handle your shelter. But I like that approach that you're talking about where it's like, it's about your energy level. Day 2 or 3, you're not going to want to, deal with building a shelter, even if you haven't, succumbed to hypothermia.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that that's not important. Yes, exposure is definitely the fastest to kill you in certain conditions.
Right.
Right. But so then you could alternate or alter that sacred order, as a teaching point based on what are your conditions that you're dealing with. But minus those conditions, obviously if it's freezing cold and you don't have enough layers on to keep you warm through the night, obviously shelter or a fire is pretty damn essential to keep you alive, right? Those elements are you have to deal with them. But even when you take those like extreme elements out of the equation, you still need some protection, and you're going to have to burn so much energy to build that shelter. Right. It's a guarantee.
In the tropics, in the tropics and I was like, just from hearing you talk about it, it seems like protecting yourself from the ground and bugs is more important for sleeping unless it's the rainy season, then protecting yourself from rain.
Definitely. But it's still possible to get hypothermia. It's not likely, obviously, because vigorous exercise works well in a warm place. Vigorous exercise works well for a minute in a freezing cold place, but you burned all that energy and it's still freaking cold out. Whereas if it's like reasonably warm, you can do some vigorous exercise and you'll be all right. But if it's continuously rainy for weeks on end and it's windy, that adds up, not necessarily to like you're going to die of hypothermia, but the energy burn that you're going through by being a little bit cold, it compounds your lack of food. So that's why I would never alter the pattern of thinking as far as shelter is concerned. Because even if, like I said, even if even if it's not about the exposure to the elements, you still have that energy burn. Obviously, water, that's like non-negotiable. You have to have your water source.
Right.
So to me, that's married to shelter. You're not going to build your shelter somewhere where you don't have a water source nearby, right? So those two are kind of together at all times, because you need water. Sure, you could do a dew wipe, and I've done dew wipes, and you can get a decent little amount of water, but again, that's like a ton of work, and you're not going to really rely on that as a regular water source.
Right. Have you ever had a
collection.
solar still produce enough water to actually maintain hydration?
For a day or two, but then I've never had a success like peeing in it and having it be enough water, or like throwing plants in there. I've done all that, and you just get diminishing returns, because once you draw all that water out of the ground. What I haven't done is I haven't done it on the beach enough, because the beaches where I would do it here, they're rocky when you get below 1.5 feet, 2 feet, and it's just inefficient digging. And so the other thing is the walls. You can't have like solid enough walls to really rely on it. But I think at the beach you'd be all right, because you have that constant saltwater influx.
Right.
It's just finding the right spot for that. But yeah, I've had it produce enough water for 2 days. Like the first day and a half, it was producing enough water. But then once you draw all that water out of the ground, like your body's using the water. So even if you're peeing in it every time, you're not putting back what you brought in. So I think of that as like a supplementary source. It's a supplement. So sure, if you're on the ocean and you have like an inverse solar still with floats, then sure, you have that water, like the salt water that you're constantly distilling. I haven't really taken the time to see. The problem is where I'm doing this at is this forest, so I can't build it in the forest and expect it to work. So I got to build it in the sun, but the beaches aren't really realistic. So most of the time it's like in openings and it's just farther away from the beach. Right. I haven't taken the time to test out recharging it with salt water.
Right.
Because you could just recharge the ground with salt water.
They also require a sheet of clear plastic, which is not always realistic that you have that on you.
You can get away with non-clear plastic. You're just not going to get nearly as much heat in the ground, right? I've used black plastic, and they work. It's just not nearly as effective as greenhouse-style plastic.
Right.
And yeah, it's like you find lots of plastic, but are you going to find a sheet of plastic? Maybe if you did small ones, because a white shopping bag would work. It's just really small, so you're just going to get a lower volume of water. I've never, after the first 2 experiences trying to make them work, I basically never bothered with trying to rely on that. But I could see using it as a supplemental. You have like a water source that's not quite fast enough. Sure, have that as a supplement, but I'm looking for a water source.
Right.
Pretty much every time. I've dug seeps before. Go ahead.
Yeah. So to back up off of water for a second, do you spend time talking to folks about, like, I always make the caveat that, like, yes, shelter, water, fire, food, or some like shelter, tools, fire, water, food tends to be more how it actually goes for me. But like the first thing I try and tell people, and in reading all the stories I've read about people living and dying through survival situations, I always try and remind people, like, the first thing you need to manage is your mindset. And I'm wondering if you talk to folks about that, because to me, it's like most deaths seem to come from when people freak out and lose touch with reality and stop having not a positive mentality in terms of like, everything's great. It doesn't matter that we just crashed in the middle of the Amazon rainforest and that like Johnny and Carol are dead. Those, those things don't matter, but not so much like a everything's great attitude, but like a positive attitude in terms of like, I need to stay in the fight. I need to be considering what resources do I have that I can put into play to make my situation even a tiny bit better. I'm going to do that. I'm going to prioritize. I'm going to like make whatever small steps I can forward to keep taking care of myself. And then you can start to think about the physical.
When I teach it, I'm usually not, like when we're doing survival trips and we're getting ready, I'm usually not addressing it like immediately before everything else, but continuously. And to me, it's more about managing expectations. Teaching together with other people that I don't teach regularly with. I've had people tell me like, oh dude, you're not building it up enough. And usually what I say to people is, okay, expect it to be uncomfortable. You're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be like, it's not going to be, you're going to be pokey, you're going to be itchy, you're going to be scratchy, you're going to be hot, you're going to be all these things. Just expect that right off the bat and be ready to overcome that. And I find that when you make, oh, this is going to be an awesome adventure of a lifetime, and I get that. Like, I understand that we also have to pay the bills, and sometimes people are looking for that. But in my mind, if you're looking for that and you pay for a survival experience, like, I don't need to tell you to be excited about that because you paid for it, right? You're here for that. So to me, it's more about managing expectations than it is about trying to give people like some encouragement of what type of attitude to take.
Right.
You know, I'm not going to encourage people to, oh, it's all good and you'll be totally fine, or oh, it's going to be really shitty and you got to be ready for really shitty. It's just more like, okay, let's expect it to be a little bit uncomfortable, but also expect that as a human we have endurance. That's our number one advantage physically, like over other animals. We don't have sharp claws, we don't run faster than every animal, we don't have sharp teeth, we don't have crushing jaws, but we have endurance over most animals, which means that we have the ability to overcome. And the other thing I also remind people of is that they have more in the tank. Like our body naturally holds in reserve. So when we spend and we think we're totally done, we have that reserve that we weren't even really expecting. And once you've done it enough times, you realize like, oh, okay, like, yeah, I'm tired right now, but I'm not at the end of this. So
right.
Yeah, I find it difficult to tell people, look at it like this, or look at it like that, or, you know, do this mental trick or do that mental trick, because you could do all that, but it might not work.
Right, at
and
the end of the
have
day,
to
it's
fail.
still just fucking hard and you have to shut up and do it.
I mean, you spend how many years, you know, hours, seconds, minutes, days, weeks, months, years building a mental pathway that you follow every moment of the day, right? You spent years building a foundation of what your brain does and how your body reacts to the world. So you're not going to just be able to like, oh, make it all positive and I'll be good. It's going to take you, you know, weeks of struggling through some of the failures that your mental framework has created. And, you know, I know that there's a lot of ways of looking at this, and, you know, suck it up and go. And it's like, yeah, you can suck it up and go to a certain point, but like you're traumatizing yourself, honestly. Like that's what you're doing in that situation. So is that the best long-term strategy? It's hard to say.
Well, right. Yeah.
And then you get into unrealistic, like, oh, I'll be fine. It's fine. Just suck it up and go. Like that's how you get yourself in situations where you're doing things that are more dangerous than you should be doing. So yeah, and I definitely, would mental attitude come before shelter, water, fire, food? I don't think so, because no matter what you do to prepare for it, you're never going to be prepared for it. That's been my experience. You're just never going to be. Unless you've done it a whole bunch of times, then sure.
Well, it's more to say that like people should check themselves and not freak out, because I guess like less, you know, we do the like survival trip thing, and that is like you can just walk to your car, you can just walk out. But like in a survival situation where that isn't an option, I try and remind people like, hey, if you ever find yourself in this situation, like after you get away from the burning plane or you get away from immediate danger, the first thing you need to do is just take a minute to be like, yo, don't be making decisions from emotion, make decisions from like as calculating a mindset as you can. And like, yes, you're going to experience discomfort, but at that point you're just thankful to be alive. And you need to be making sure that you're not like freaking out, because people do like wander in circles in a panic and burn all their energy, or, you know, make crazy decisions because they're hypothermic or they're dehydrated or they're just filled with fear. That like, one, that's a great reason to bring a buddy with you in most circumstances, and try not to like rely on your own faculties, because if you have, you know, hypothermia or dehydration, you're not making decisions well. But two, like that mindset piece can be the crux at which you succeed or fail, you know, given a real dangerous situation where you could die if you don't think it through.
Well, that's where I think having some kind of framework that's like your permanent framework that you work off of comes in.
Right.
Because you might alter it because, oh, it's not really that cold, so I don't have to work the shelter just yet. Or alter it in that, like, holy shit, there's an animal right there and I have this stick, like maybe I can get it. Sure, you would alter it, but just having that framework, okay, the plane just crashed, you know, let me get away from that, like, oh shit, what do I do now? Oh yeah, shelter, water, fire, food, right? Just having that framework, even if you alter it, helps with that mental part. And yes, obviously the mental, emotional response is probably before all of it. But you can't train that. I mean, you can train it, but you can't teach it.
Right.
You could say all you want, have that positive attitude, but if you're not training that, it doesn't matter what you heard.
Right. I think it's about inoculation more than like hearing something. It's about putting yourself into difficult situations and learning to rely on yourself, and learning that like you can get through difficult situations, and that you do, like you said, like the way that you understand how your body and your mind have more reserves is because you put yourself into situations where you hit what you thought was your limit, and then you found you had more reserves. Right?
Yeah.
So,
It's got to be experience. And that's why I think it's, yes, you want to have that positive, like, okay, it's an adventure, right? Like, it's an adventure, but to have the expectation right off the bat, okay, there's going to be discomfort involved.
right.
Even if that's just as far as you go with that part of it. Now, oh my God, you're not trying to fear-monger yourself and be like, oh, I could die with this and I could die with that. It's more just like, I'm going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be scratchy. It's going to be itchy. It's going to be tiring. Because that's something that you can then manage, right? My comfort zone is here. I'm a little bit more uncomfortable. My comfort zone goes from here to here. So, I think it's more important just looking at it realistically than thinking that doing I'm not saying that doing a meditation or doing like some mental practice or I'm not saying that doesn't help. Of course that helps. I'm just saying you're not going to be able to rely on it solely, because you're not doing those meditations, you're not doing those like mental, emotional, self-awareness practices. You're not super uncomfortable. Right? You're not like laying in a scratchy, itchy bed with some bugs jumping on you when you do it, because it's just not usually how people do it.
Right.
If you did that, sure, now you already expanded your comfort zone and it's not so bad.
Right. Or just doing survival trips where you do have like the ability to tap out if you need to, or like pushing yourself to do shelter overnights, or pushing yourself to be like, all right, I'm going to go out and I'm going to make a fire on this snowy day from scratch, even if my hands get cold, or even if like I meet with failure, I'm going to keep pushing my edges until I either really fail or I succeed. Like, I think there is an element to that. I think like watching wildlife is pretty amazing in terms of that, because they're just so goddamn rugged compared to modern humans. And like
crazy.
The shit that they put up with in terms of like harsh conditions or failure, or the amount of times like a bobcat fails at hunting when I'm tracking and I see like the hunt happen and fail. It's incredible. And then but they don't have a choice. they have to
Well,
keep
they also
hunting until
weren't-
they kill something.
They also weren't filled with unrealistic survival expectations from the time they were born.
Right.
That we really are, you know?
Yeah.
Even somebody was just telling me about somebody they were talking with who was like, oh, why are you... It seems like you're just playing make-believe by doing these primitive skills, right? Why would you do that when you have all this gear that you could... Why would you go hunting with primitive gear when you have all this modern gear? Why would you go and build a shelter when you can put up the tent? Well, because when the tent gets ripped, when the sleeping bag, you know, when you lose the backpack, you know, when the fire starter's broken, you're 10 times more screwed than if you didn't. So I think just inherently just practicing these skills, you're going to fail. You're dealing with those failures. You're learning how to deal with those failures. You're learning how to come through with it. Just doing that helps to bring you to a more realistic view of, oh, okay, I could do the fire building when I have a perfectly seasoned piece of cedar that I, you know, carved in my bedroom while I was watching Alone, and I can go out in the backyard and use my jute tinder bundle and get a fire every single time. But yeah, like you said, when your fingers are frozen and it's a shitty piece of willow, which is like been sitting on the ground for however long, and you fail that first 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 times, right? It's an entirely different thing, and have you set unrealistic expectations? I have a friend who teaches in Quebec, and he's always doing these crazy uncomfortable things, like slogging through huge swamps and like laying down in cold streams, and I was always like, I don't like, why do that to yourself? But it's kind of a good practice, because, you know, it's like, yes, he can go to his car, and it's one thing to be like, I'm going to be as comfortable as I can make myself until I have to go back to my car and go back to my job. I think it's a good idea to spend some time like, I'm going to make myself as uncomfortable as humanly possible before going back to my car, just to see what that is and see how my body reacts and see how my gear reacts and see what my real issues are. I think that we don't practice extremes, and I'm including myself in this. We don't practice extremes enough to really know what our level of expectation should be.
Yeah.
However,
especially as we get
time,
older, I feel like when I was 20, my likelihood of being like, I'm going to see how high I can climb in this tree just to do it, or I'm going to just like constantly pushing edges. And now as I've like entered my mid 40s, I'm like, but it's not warm and comfortable there.
Yeah, but that's also based off of all those uncomfortable moments.
Right.
You know, you do that when you're young. Yeah, there's so many things that I did where it was like, I look at some of those things and I'm like, I'm not going to climb up this thing now.
Right.
Like, you know, just the other day I was like following these goats on a hunt, and I was just like, I got to this point and I was like, there's no reason.
Right.
I could have totally climbed up that cliff, and I'm like, this is pointless.
Right. The
Like,
line
why should I
between dumb and
endanger
tough.
myself?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very, very, very different there.
So I wanted to ask, because you mentioned it, do you talk to folks about like the first thing you pick up in a situation is a stick, and like just tuck it in the back of your belt? Like, because here,
You know,
food is such an issue that like if you are, like I tell people, the first thing you pick up is a stick. Ideally, one end is sharp enough to dig a root out of the ground. If that way, like when you are collecting shit for your shelter and you see that fat gray squirrel, you have a chance at least of stalking and killing it. It shouldn't be your focus. You shouldn't be hunting, but like first thing first, pick up a weapon or the ability to dig a root. And then like while you're doing the rest of shelter, water, and fire, you're at least ready for that moment of opportunity.
my encouragement is a stick and a rock.
Right.
Most people are much more used to throwing something that's like in your hand like that, like a ball, than they are throwing a stick with the spin and fitting it through brush. So yes, to me the stick is the stab, and the rock is the throw. I also something that usually when people practice throwing something, they throw it like 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. I like 5 feet. Practice throwing right at your foot. Can you hit that thing that's 3 feet away? Because if you can't hit that thing that's 3 feet away, now you're really screwed, right? Because I would say better to get closer than anything. right? What type of stick, what type of rock, what are you going to throw, what are you going to stab with? Like, try to get reasonably close. Can you get reasonably closer? Get reasonably closer. If it takes you 2 hours, get closer.
Right.
You know, if it takes you 4 hours, get closer. Like, ensure that you're going to have a better chance at it, because it doesn't do you any good to scare it away at 20 yards when you probably couldn't hit that small spot at 20 yards any day.
Right.
Sure, if you're a baseball player and you're used to throwing that ball, then pick up a rock, you got a pretty damn good chance. But if you don't do that all the time and you don't have confidence in that throw, get closer. Same with archery, right? Practice at 10 yards, get to 10 yards, right? If you practice at 20 yards with archery, get to 10 yards. If you practice at 30 yards, get to 10 yards. Like, ensure yourself that you've got a better chance at shooting. And something that I definitely want to mention as far as these priorities are concerned is you do the shelter first because of that energy burn. You make sure that your water is insured so that you just have it and you don't have to burn all this energy to get to your water. You start that fire as soon as you can and you keep it going because you don't have to burn that energy. And now, burn every ounce of energy to get the food. Like, we were talking about the mentality, and I think something that people don't necessarily talk about when they talk about that positive mental attitude is don't sit around. Right? We were talking about this in a previous podcast. Like, you're not gaining a damn thing by saving your energy for later. Yes, if you're super tired, you need to rest. It's not the right time of day. You know, take your breaks when you need to take your breaks, but you can't just be like, okay, I'm just going to spend the next 2 days recovering. If you don't have food coming in and you don't have calories coming in, you're not recovering anything. Right? You're just prolonging the inevitable. So you have to, you got to spend those calories to get them back. And so that's why I totally stick to that sacred order, because you have to just make those other three, the shelter, water, and fire, and obviously mental attitude as well. You have to make those things so that they're just there, and you don't have to spend that energy on it, because you're going to need to spend the energy on the food.
Right.
Period.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, like, from teaching people for so many years, we do this like long-term class where people spend 9 months with us, and then at the end they go out on a trip, and it's like, it's become clear to me that shelter, water, and fire and basic tool making are pretty learnable within that 9 month period. Like, they can get to a level of proficiency that is like, they can build a good debris shelter, they can build a good group shelter, they can take rocks off the land, make them sharp, make a bow drill kit, get a fire from scratch with no tools or a knife or anything. They can make a bark container and rock boil water in it, or find and process a spring. Like, we have tons of springs here, so that's way easier and less effort and less gross than rock boiling all your water. So like, those things are all really doable, but food, man, getting like 2,500 or 2,000 calories, let alone like the energy output to try and get to 3,500 calories a day, like, that
Especially
shit is so hard. Right, even in like
Especially
the peak of the summer here, or like the peak of the fall when the roots are at their fattest and the animals are at their like dumbest and fattest because they're all trying to breed before they like hunker down for the winter. It is so goddamn hard. Because you either have to learn how to trap or hunt animals with primitive weapons, which is like a lifetime
Very
study.
difficult.
You have to start with tracking and learning all this like very intense natural history, so you understand where the animals are and when they're there and what their defenses are and where they're weak and where they're not. Or you have to learn all the plants that can kill you, and then all the plants that you can eat, and not only when to eat them, but how to process them. And it's like, it's a lifetime study, you know?
It really shows you how we're just not meant to do it by ourselves.
Right. Well, and that's an interesting topic that I think like could be its own podcast. But like the myth of the lone survivalist, like out on the land conquering nature.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
No, we're pack animals. Not to mention like knowledge of place is hugely important, especially for food. And then like handed down customs and practices and knowledge from an intact culture that's living off that land base. Like without those things, getting that 2,500 to 3,000 calories a day, 365 days a year in Vermont is a fucking joke.
I mean, honestly, in like a true survival situation of a lone person, you're better off just being a super hard worker your whole life and used to being uncomfortable and working super hard than you are practicing these skills and never putting yourself out there. Really, like that's really what it comes down to, is working super hard. And I don't think it's, I don't want to say I don't think it's possible, but I tend to want to lean towards that as a lone survivalist. I don't think it's possible to live long term. I really don't.
Right.
You're going to come up against some conditions that one person can't handle by themselves. If it's like just a bad year for acorns, and now you lost your crop that you relied on 2-3 years straight, you know, and now what do? Have you been practicing, like, gathering those roots? Oh wait, it's not the right time of year. Like, if you had one other person, and you know, this was definitely, you had mentioned learning the shelter, water, and fire over the course of 9 months. I would say that you could get to a point where in a real survival situation, you'd be okay. I think if you put a month of really hard practice in,
Right.
you could get that shelter, water, and fire. You could get that basket making, those ancillary skills, the tool making parts that you need. But I will say, as far as the food procurement, I mean, you got to rely on hunting or fishing. You have to. Sure, if you have that plant-based knowledge, sure, then obviously rely on that. Plants don't move. That's great. But that's years of study to really be good enough at it, to know how to prepare it, that you're actually going to eat it.
Right. Well, not to mention caloric density. Like, I mean, down there you have coconuts and you have fruit, which are more potent and more abundant, but like,
I still hunt and fish.
right, exactly. And like up here, if the acorns aren't going off,
You're done without
yeah,
hunting.
there's like, what the hell are you gonna do for like a huge boost of calories? Like it's pretty rough. You can only eat so many apples in a day, and that's only
even
available
so
for a
just
tiny
eating
window.
apples, you're gonna
Right?
be
Yeah. No.
shitting your pants off.
Yeah.
in a
No.
number
It's
of
like,
days.
dude, we had this one dude on a survival trip who, he's a friend of mine. He was like, dude, because we had taught him you could just eat basswood leaves, and he was like, after the trip, he was
damn.
like, man, those basswood leaves really stuffed me up. Like it was like a cork, you know. And I was like, for years, I was like, man, I've eaten a lot of basswood leaves, but never have they like affected me like that. And finally, after years, I was like, man, how many leaves did you eat? And he was like a brown paper shopping bag's worth a day.
Oh man.
So this dude had
That's like what a
essentially
black
made a cordage plug in his colon.
I was gonna say that's what a black bear does before it hibernates.
Exactly.
And then you see it in the spring when it poops out the butt plug, and you're like, oh my god, how did it eat all those leaves?
Oh man,
Pretty classic.
it's hilarious.
Don't eat
Like I had never
don't eat a butt
thought.
plug's worth of leaves.
Right, that's like such an incredible. But he just sat there like a gorilla, just masticating basswood leaves and like deforesting.
Did he pound them? Did he anyhow process them?
chewed
He
'em.
just chewed them up. Like, oh, my jaw hurts and my butt won't poop out the leaves.
Oh god,
Brilliant.
hilarious.
But you know, you're talking about like the lifetime pursuit of hunting, and I don't want to make it sound simpler than it has to be, but I think that if you go slow, right? Like if you just 3 seconds per step, you do like a fox walk, right? You're just moving slow, and you just keep moving slow that whole time, and you're moving through the forest slowly and carefully the whole time, but you don't stop, right? You have the endurance and you just keep going. I don't want to say that's better than a lifetime's worth of experience, but it could be equal to a lifetime's worth of experience. Personally,
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying I'm the greatest hunter. I'm not saying that at all, but I've hung out with people who've hunted a long time and just, you know, telling hunting stories and like, oh, you know, that deer was about like 7 yards. And I was telling these stories, and after the third or fourth time, the guy was like, man, bullshit, you don't know how to judge yards. And I was like, no, I know it's 7 yards. I said, well, how the fuck are you getting so close to all these deer? I never get that close to them. And that's not to say I'm like better in any way, shape, or form. It's like he learned that you sit really far away. He learned that you're way far away. And in those situations, I was ignorant to that, but just moving really slowly and really carefully. And I've personally found that if you're doing that all the time, you're gonna come across game.
What do
You're gonna
you
put
do
yourself
with
in that
your
situation.
mind? Like the thing I find with myself and with students, that the hardest thing about keeping them moving slow or keeping myself moving that slow is that like stuff comes up in your brain and you're like, I want to see what's over that hill, or oh, like this is crazy, I'm not going to see anything, and doubt sets in, or like, what are you doing with your mindset or your mind when you're in those situations where you're moving that slow for that long?
I do like a breath reminder where every breath in, I'm paying attention to the landscape, and every breath out, I'm paying attention to how I'm moving and my effect on the landscape. And 999 of those of 1,000 breaths, there's nothing changing, but that one breath that I get that opportunity, you know. So that's been the only thing that I've been able to that's worked consistently. Yes, I'm reminding myself to use my peripheral vision to fall back into wide angle vision. I think that's enormous. And studying neuropsychology and the way our brain functions and the parts of our brain that are responsible for that broad intake of information versus that tunnel vision and seeking things out on the landscape and the parts of our brain that are utilized for there. When we do that, when we focus in hard, we're engaging the parts of our brain that are that deal with abstracting things and manipulating things. And so, in other words, you're telling yourself a story and you're sticking to your story versus like constantly going back into that wide angle, like I'm just trying to take in the broad picture. You're more open to what's going on around you, because you know, a lot of times, even if you're moving a little bit faster, you're probably going past a whole bunch of animals you just weren't paying quite close enough attention.
Right.
So that's the only thing that I've been able to do that's consistently worked, because you're always breathing.
Right.
And then it's not hard. It's not hard as you lose it. You go into that mental part where you're rushing a little bit. You take a deep breath because you just take a deep breath and you have that reminder, like, oh wait, I got to be paying attention. So your breath is always there. That's been the only thing that's been effective for that. I find that especially when I'm with a group, and I think it's just because there's a need outside of myself, it's not as hard to keep myself slow. It's more when I'm by myself that my bad habits start to take over.
Yeah.
You know, and that's why I try not to you know, like, oh, do this meditation or do that or do this mental practice or that mental practice. Do it if you're going to do a mental practice as a survival skill. You got to do it all day, every day. You got to be like, I'm going to do this 500 times today, and carry a notebook with you and put a tally in every time you did that. Okay, wait, pay attention. All right, put a tally in the notebook and count to 500. That's the only way you're going to do it. You have to be doing it all the time. People who grew up in a you know, I don't want to say primitive, but people who lived, you know, from their own means at all times from the time they were born, they knew to pay attention. Right, so a matter of life and death, so it wasn't hard. When you grow up on frickin' McDonald's and television, bullshit that I grew up on, you gotta fight really hard against those mental patterns. It's
Right.
tough. It's definitely tough.
Yeah, totally.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I think like we both agree, you know, that with the caveats of like, okay, you have to consider your most immediate needs, but that shelter still falls first in most cases. And then with water, I find most of the water procurement skills require some sort of tool set and or fire. So why do you think that water was put before fire? Because like any primitive methodology for purification, like boil, or really it's pasteurization, where like boiling out the things that can, you know, viruses or bacteria. But like, why do you think
it's all about I think it's a
came-
procurement thing. I think it's a
Right.
procurement thing where like, you know, having a source that's consistent enough that you can actually boil. I think those other methods, the dew wipe, the any water collection, rain collection system, any solar still, those are like serious emergency fallback plans. So that's why I would put that. That's why I would put water further up.
Right.
But I think in most cases, fire is right even with it. Because why would you go and find a pristine spring that takes you, 15 miles and X number of calories to get when you have a stream right there? Just because it's not safe to drink out of straight, like, just start a fire, stay close to that water you have access to, and boil that water. I think it's just as important. I would almost put those two like exactly together, the fire and the water. I don't see any other way to realistically deal with it. I mean, this is you wouldn't do this in a survival situation, but I'm often drinking water that it's clean. There's no, like, I'm not getting it after it comes out of a cow field or anything like that, but like there's been plenty of times where I found a spring and just drank it. And knock on wood, I haven't gotten sick yet. It's gonna happen one of these days. It's gonna make me sick. I think that I think it's an important thing to know, because are you gonna get sick and die before you make it to the road, or are you gonna get dehydration and not make it to the road because you got dehydrated first?
You said drink from a spring. Did you mean a stream?
No, I've drank from streams, but I just springs, places where the water's springing out of the water, or springing out of the ground.
Right.
So but I have drank out of streams before.
Right. It's interesting because like in talking to water scientists, like hydrologists and stuff, basically they'll all say like you can only truly ID a spring by having the water tested, and then you really look into like how they form and how to find them. And it can be pretty confusing in Vermont to tell the difference between an underground stream that has reemerged and a spring. Like, I've definitely mistaken the two.
What I want to know is, what difference does it make?
Well, right. If it's going underground for several hundred yards, it should be clean.
Not just that, but if I have to test the spring and I have to test the stream, what does it matter which one I drink out of if I can't trust either of them without testing it first?
Well, right.
If I can't trust either of them without boiling it first,
what we go with is like,
spring.
If it's coming directly out of the ground and you can't find anything that's like within the water course a couple hundred yards above it that is like clearly going underground, and the temperature is like 42 degrees, which you can tell in the winter because they'll literally be steaming. Yeah. And then in the summer, you stick your hand in it, and if it's like, there's a difference between cold and like a cold that gives your hand like an ache after holding it in there a minute. And so like we look for the spots where like you dig a basin, it refills quickly, it clears quickly, and then you stick your hand in there and it like aches after a minute. You're like, okay, this is probably good to drink. I've checked above it. There's nothing above it. And we've had really good luck with that, again, knock on wood, but like that tends to be our go-to just because I've put so much time into rock boiling and it's pretty brutal. Like drinking.
Oh man, it's tough. Just
hot,
making that container.
Ashy water, right. Exactly. Making something that's big enough, especially if you're in a group, to really process that much water, it's a challenge.
I haven't really done much with solar purification, just take a bottle and stick it out. My preferred method for boiling is to find a glass bottle and carefully boil the water in a glass bottle, because it just tastes a lot better than rock boiled water.
Yeah.
I've always been dumb enough to just test out water sources, just like drank some, and I haven't gotten Giardia yet. I'm sure it's going to happen one of these days if I keep on persisting with that tendency. But I still fall back to that, like, okay, what's going to kill me first? Am I going to like stop functioning because I'm so dehydrated, or is getting a sickness from this water going to kill me first?
Right.
It's like a crazy gamble to take. If it was a real survival situation, I'd probably boil it and deal with the bad taste. But then again, if I do that enough times, and so a lot of the... Yeah, I guess I need to spend more time like studying the effects of some of the pathogens that get into our water. I haven't experienced them yet, so I can't really say, but like how quickly is that pathogen going to start dehydrating you?
Right.
'Cause
Giardia.
if the pathogen makes
is
you
like-
sick, but it doesn't well, Giardia is rough because you dehydrate.
Well, but it takes like a week to 2 weeks to incubate in your gut before you're experiencing.
Yeah, so you get 2 freaking weeks.
Yeah. The I love it when you see the description. It's like symptoms: explosive projectile diarrhea. Man, and I've had friends who have had Giardia, and it sounds rough.
Yeah, explosive projectile diarrhea does not sound like anything I feel like dealing with. But if it
No.
comes 2 weeks later, then I can get to the road and go to the doctor.
Yeah,
Does that mean
violated from the
suppositories are
inside
out?
out is the expression that one of my friends said. Yeah. So water is, huge. I guess that's like, we could have a whole episode on gear, but in terms of like things I carry in my pack, first of all, like switching to a single-walled steel canteen, so that
Huge.
Yeah, so that I can always just like scoop and boil, and
Boiling
then
that sucker.
water purification tablets weigh nothing, and water purification drops are also pretty light and easy to carry.
Yeah, the
And now, dude,
iodine.
when we started
Way.
with these skills, the filters were like kind of crappy, and they were those pump filters that were
Crappy
huge
and
and heavy.
huge.
Yeah,
And breaky.
but
Like,
now
not
they
really
have
designed.
those. Have you seen the squeeze filters where you just like?
Those things are great.
Yeah, those things are awesome. So like, I don't.
I might add a small piece of like denim cloth or like tight cloth just for do a pre-filtration. It's
Right.
not hard to carry. You could have like a little pouch made out of it that your iodine droplets go into.
Right.
Yeah, I always was an advocate of the iodine or the tablets because it's so easy to carry.
Right. I put them in
and
every
it's
med
so easy to
kit.
do.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I haven't. I did the life straws. I bought a couple of those because that's what they had. That was just easy to carry for after a hurricane here, so that I could just go and drink out of the stream in the middle of the day instead of having to pump the water into the tank and then run it by gravity back down. And I only like those because of the size and the ease to carry. But the pressure, I forget what they call them, those pressure bags. Those are pretty freaking great. It's true that we have some great technology there. I still think you should practice that rock boiling in case you're caught. This filter breaks, you're done.
Right. Back to like the idea of the pace plan we talked about a few episodes ago. Like I always try and think about having a pace plan for water. Like my primary source is that I'm carrying enough or I know where the water is available. My alternate source is like I've got the tabs or I've got a filter. And then contingency is I've got a steel canteen, and emergency is that I can
Emergency
boil.
rock boil.
Yeah.
Totally. And I since we're talking about like the priorities, I think you kind of have to practice everything. But honestly, just having that framework, and I already mentioned this, but like it's such a huge mental part. Or like you're talking about that pace plan. What are my ideas? How am I going to deal with oh shit moments. When I took the standard class at Tracker School, which is kind of like a mind-blowing thing especially for a dork who didn't spend enough time in the woods as a kid, and immediately after I went from taking the class to doing a survival, like a survival practice. I don't want to say a survival situation, but like put ourselves into a survival situation for like 4 days. And that was a whole crazy story that we could definitely not talk about on this podcast, but pretty freaking hilarious.
An embarrassing 4 days of getting your ass beat.
Oh my! No, it wasn't embarrassing. It was an uncomfortable, ridiculous. We can't talk about it, but it's freaking. We'll talk about it personally. It's freaking hilarious, hilarious. And basically, at a certain point, I was like, Intervision's telling me to leave," and somebody else was like, "I'm going with you." Anyway, so I'm like, my whole paradigm has started to shift, and now I've been in the wilderness for like days, literally feeding myself from May apples to one squirrel we got, and like grass seeds and shit we're finding. And then I was like, I needed a ride to the bus station, and I got a ride to the bus station itself. even though the bus wasn't till the next day. And I'm like in the middle of like the bad neighborhood of Easton, Pennsylvania. I get into the bus station and my brain was just like going nuts. Like I was like, what the fuck do I do? Like, where am I right now? So I went into the bathroom immediately. You had to pay 50 cents to get into this bathroom. It literally, anyway, I'm like in the bathroom and my brain, I'm just freaking out, right? Like total panic mode. I'm like, okay, what do I do? What do I do? Wait, shelter, water, fire, food. Like, okay, all right, I got a tent and a sleeping bag. Okay, I'm good. Water. Okay, yeah. Let me grab my water bottle, filled it up in the bathroom there. I'm like, okay, fire? Oh, go. I got my bow drill kit. Okay, all right. I think I'm gonna go get some food. And I went and got some crackers and set up my tent in a janky little spot by the river. It was pretty great, but it was pretty amazing how like it just immediately. All it was just my brain. Like any normal person would have been totally fine, but I was not normal in that moment. And
Right.
just having that plan alone, right? It's like even if you get it wrong, even if you get that order of priorities wrong, and you did this thing first when you should have done that thing first, just having it there, it's like you need that plan, you need that idea of how to troubleshoot.
Right.
Or you're not going to be able to troubleshoot.
It's kind of interesting, like, the people who tend to follow the path of learning these skills, you know, we all tend to be, like, freedom-loving in terms of, you know, don't tell me what to do and trying to live a life that's less structured. But when it comes down to it, being cut loose of any structure whatsoever is not how most humans really want to live. Like, most humans...
That's not how any animal lives, I
Right,
don't think.
right. You need some sort of scaffolding to base things on, or you're just going to be, you know, wandering in a way that's pretty uncomfortable. It's like, you know, you don't want to be so regimented that you can't alter or vary the plan or adapt to the circumstances as they change, but you also don't want just like no idea of what to do or how to proceed.
Yeah, being an individual is amazing up to a point,
Right.
you know, and we're never completely individual.
Well, and that's why it's so interesting, like, when you do read about indigenous cultures and their cultural traditions, like, a lot of them have these really beautiful interplays between sensible survival mentalities and then, like, useful personal narratives that, like, allowed them to pass on survival knowledge without creating a rigid, dogmatic scaffolding. You know, like, there's pretty beautiful technology there in terms of, like, understanding the world. And that, you know, I feel like that's one of the things about trying to navigate these skills in the modern world that can be so difficult is that, you know, we're not coming from an inherited tradition.
You catching this distraction right here? I wish you could hear about this inherited tradition.
Well, right.
Like,
I mean,
you
we're
know,
trying to recreate it and build it for our kids. And, like,
Yeah.
that's one of the things about, you know, when you were talking about, like, why bother working on these skills and that question that you got, that's one of the things that came to mind is, and we, again, could do a whole episode on, like, why bother studying these skills in 2024. But, like, keeping any sort of relationship to our wild ability as a human being is pretty important for the human race. Like, it's
I think that what you're like, usually you're talking about indigenous cultures and the framework that they have, and there had to be people who were trying to be individuals back then,
right.
But they weren't filled with 5 billion distractions, nor the modern hubris of we're away and above from nature.
Right.
That's literally our modern view, is that we are here and nature is here and we can subjugate it, but that happens to not be the case on any level whatsoever. And so when people do find them, we'll train survival, we'll train, practice, learn how to be self-sufficient, but we tend to have these models of it that go to the extreme of we're above and beyond and set aside. And those two worlds don't really fit, and I think that's why I think that's why the mental skills end up being such an important part in our modern world, because we're applying a framework that doesn't apply there. Right. Like you were saying in the last issue, like nature doesn't care. I mean, I actually disagree with that. I think nature does care. It just doesn't care any more about you as it does anything else. Right. That blade of grass could stick into your foot or give you literally a little grass cut. You get infected and you die. Right. There's no subjugation of nature. You know, nature's gonna come back and win, especially when you put yourself in that situation where it's just you in your natural element. Like, yeah, nature cares, but not any more about you than it does about that ant. You know, so and I think just realizing that is important.
Right, and that goes back to what you were talking about in terms of like you need to adjust your comfort zone. Like the situation is what the situation is, and what's going to make you comfortable in it is not creating a situation in which there is no discomfort. It's saying I will be fine with discomfort. Right? Like, so that's that changing. I mean, and this is something Brown talked about all the time, is that like surrender mentality. And it's not like surrender, give up. It's surrender that hubris, surrender that like need to control all situations, surrender that like need to judge or think a feeling or judge an experience. And that can be incredibly challenging. And it definitely is something that like it requires, I think, to do it without like mentally traumatizing yourself, it requires, you know, a process over time, right?
Definitely.
Like to slowly work yourself into different comfort zones. But I think I think that is one of the things people really gain through long-term study of the skills, is not just an increase in proficiency, but also an increase in acceptance of the situation and a surrendering of like your need to control everything.
It's insane how many times you'll hear people say, I could never do that.
Yeah.
It doesn't even have to be survival wise. It'd be like sleeping in a tent instead of in a bed. I could never do that. Right? And how often we believe that, we buy that myth that we're telling, I could never do that. It's like, yeah, you could. You totally could. It actually wouldn't be hard at all. What you're really saying is I would never choose to do that, right? Which is fine, and some people say that, or like, you know, like we don't realize how much we stop ourselves, and I think that's that modern construct that like we have this belief that we'll be able to control everything because everything's been so controlled for so long.
We're right, and all you need is more money to influence your situation more and more, and to create more and more of like an insulative bubble between yourself and the harsh realities of life.
Until the money's worth nothing.
Right.
And then you're screwed.
Well, and that's like
we'll finally get even with Elon Musk. We're going to get him.
Well, that's the beauty of these skills, and like one of the things that's always attracted me to them since I was like a pissed off punk teenager is like I got pretty fed up with all the rule books that human beings were making, because especially these days, so many of them are underpinned by like falsities and lies that are designed to just turn you into a consumer. That
you can see when you're 16 years old.
Right. But that like when you go out into the natural world, it's not trying to sell you anything. It is what it is. That's like the initial rule book that was here, whether by like creation or evolution and chance, like it doesn't really matter. That is the original programming or the original like rule book. And so to put yourself in communication with that, in conversation with that, to me always seemed like a genuine way of like hammering myself into something more of what I wanted to be, which was like a self-reliant, able, useful person, you know, as opposed to like following rule books that ultimately, you know, had these ulterior motives that were benefiting other people.
Yeah, and it's crazy how much freedom there is in that natural framework. Right. You can't break those rules, right? You have to have some sort of shelter. You have to have some water. You have to have some sort of heat source or energy source, whether it's a fire or electricity, and you have to have some food. Or you just have to have those. But it's total and complete freedom of how you're going to do that. you have to think about all those things. I don't want to take too much of this and then I won't have it for that. You know, you have to think about that if it's long term, but it's total freedom in there. It doesn't, you know, there's no better or worse way to do it. Whereas, in our modern world, it's ignorant of the fact of what the rules really actually are.
Right.
And I think when you get to that base nature level, because there's no leeway, right? The earth is not going to just be like, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to give you water. Here you go.
Right.
You know, it's just not. It's not going to happen.
Right. Turn this knob and you'll be warm.
Exactly. So, I think we're pretty good on that subject. Shall we show and tell? Is it time?
It's time. It's time.
Because I know you don't like. I know you don't like that. Oh, my
I don't
God,
like
what
it.
is that thing?
Yeah. What is that
thing? You don't like that.
No.
You don't like that.
What did you peel off? What did you peel off the road?
This is an iguana skin. This was not peeled off of the road. This one I caught with a noose on a stick, and I bark tanned it.
Is that the one that shit on that
it's like-
dude?
It could have been the one that shit on that dude. I think.
What
we
an
have to write
incredible
down, but it could have
tropical
been him.
experience. Dude comes down from Vermont and gets shit on by an iguana.
Pretty quickly too. He was sitting in the same place a couple days later and almost got shit on again. Yeah, so I haven't decided what to do with this iguana skin, and you know, with lizards and snakes, you can see the brown and the black, and that's the brown is where the scales are at, and it's caught some of the tannins from the vegetable tan, and the black is the actual skin color. It starts off like an amazing green color, or like a swirly gray, dark and light gray, and then it ends up pretty much black, which has its downsides, but you know, whatever, it is what it is.
What are you
And I
using
wasn't
for
sure
your
what-
tannin source?
Tan bark, so tree bark. Taking
Nice.
tree bark and boiling it, and then changing the water every day. Boiling it till it's dark brown, and then soaking it for about a week, and then stretching. And I was thinking of making a helmet out of it. Let's see, is that gonna work? I gotta get it to lay down. We've been doing a lot of snake skins, tanning a lot of snake skins. This is a lot
Nice.
darker than these things start off as. And I think we have enough for a couple of the projects we're going to be doing. But
Oh man,
both of these
Sarah would love
animals-
to tan a lizard or a snake when we're down there.
and both of these are like non-native sources. The snakes kill a lot of birds now that they're done with most of the rats and mice. So it's great. It's really wonderful. Look at this. I got my sun shelter now. That's so stylish. Look at my Mad Max Mad Max hat right now.
Yeah.
That's great. That's freaking brilliant.
It
right
also
there.
will protect you from other humans because you'll terrify them.
What are you talking about? This is how you pick up the right kind of chicks. You kidding me?
I was gonna
Hey,
ask
ladies.
if
Where'd they all
if that
go?
helmet was to protect you from Carmen.
No, are you kidding me? Ooh, I like your helmet. Take that wherever you want to take it. That's
Yeah.
fine. But I know that you don't like that.
I don't like it at all. No, I'm
dressed
excited
in
to
my
get into
rags.
some of that when we're there. It's funny because I have my "You Don't Like This" is also a piece of headwear.
I totally don't like that.
Yeah, it's a felted hat.
Have you tried felting from any wild animal sources? Have you like bear hair or you know, anything, coyote hair, anything like that? How's that work?
Yeah, so basically all hairs are scaled. Like if you look at them on a close-up, you know, under a microscope, they're fibers that lay with like a scaling like this. And some animals have more scales per inch than others. And when you shock them with hot water and an alkaline solution, those hooks or those scales open so that it's like this. And then when you agitate them against each other, those hooks grab each other and start to get knotted up. Like if you imagine a string with a bunch of fish hooks tied like every 2 inches, and then you made a pile of those strings and you rub them together, it would just like make a giant knot. That's essentially
even larger guard hairs on like, let's say, a coyote or something like that would still be feltable.
right. So it's just a matter of how
much
much you have to shock it and agitate it. So like certain animals have more or less scales. Wool happens to have tons of scales, and so it felts really well. But most animals, especially their under fur, like the downy fur that will shed on most animals, is pretty feltable. More like the guard hairs tend to be less feltable, or like something like moose hair, like an ungulate upper layer of fur is going to be pretty hard to felt because it doesn't have very many of those scales.
Okay.
So yeah, this is wool, and then it's black walnut with iron is the black, and then black walnut without iron is the brown, and then the whiter color is just the natural wool color, and this is like a little bit of winter camo. But
nice.
Wool is almost
my winter camo.
Yeah, wool is almost too
Can't see
hot.
me.
Like unless it's really cold or I'm not active, like as soon as I start moving, this thing's got to come off because a dense layer of felt, like it traps a high percentage of your body heat. So
Yeah, I have a wool t-shirt that's really thin and it's got a great camo pattern, but every time I start moving, I'm just like, ugh, I need cotton. You know,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
it works great in chilly, but not in warm at all.
Right.
So is that it? Have we run through yet another episode?
We have,
look
man.
Look at how I look at the end of this one. I'm looking ragged by the end of this. but my hat looks fantastic.
It was a survival episode, so
You like that? I'm ready. I'm totally ready right now.
I don't like
great.
that. I don't like that at all.
I know you don't like that. Of course you don't like that. Kidding me? Well, thanks for listening, everybody. If you got some ideas for stuff you want us to talk about, then hit us up.
I've also been meaning to say
yeah.
this. The YouTube gods require us to say, please like and subscribe.
Please, please like and subscribe. Do I point to the icon? Like and subscribe.
We're
I
going to
just
keep
point
doing
all
it
over.
anyway, so you don't have to like and subscribe.
It doesn't matter.
More
How
people
could we
will
not
see
with
it.
a sweet hat like this? I gotta do it. Gotta keep doing it.
Yeah.
Right? I don't.
But we've
It's
been
awesome.
appreciating the comments. We've been appreciating it, so hit us up.
Keep it coming.
Yeah.
All right.
Till next time.
Peace, everybody.